Welcome back to Monday Mod Tips. I am Captain Xavier, and today I'm going to be doing a complete disassembly and reassembly of the Nerf Stampede. The Stampede was, as far as I know, the first magazine-fed automatic electric spring-powered blaster, more commonly known nowadays as AEBs. There were several other electronic springers at the time, but none of them were magazine-fed, which made this blaster somewhat unique, and it makes it a more complicated blaster. There are some interesting things that are going to be going on the inside that we're going to be taking a look at, so this is going to be a bit more involved. Now, let's take a look at the controls, so that when this is all over, I can actually show that I have gotten it functioning again. The blaster does have an on switch, which is unusual for most Nerf blasters do not have an on-off switch, but it has the on-off switch on the left side, so it's not fully ambidextrous. The magazine release, however, is ambidextrous, and I appreciate that. There is a jam door up at the top, but this blaster will not operate, it will not cycle, unless it has a magazine in. It does have a series of electric locks that only work if the magazine is inserted. So we put in a magazine, we make sure the blaster is turned on, we pull the trigger, and it cycles. And it does in fact cycle on an open bolt, which is interesting. We'll get into that when we get it apart. There is also a lock on the jam door. If the jam door is open, it will not operate, even if it's only open a little bit. This has caused me trouble when this the jam door snagged on a piece of equipment and it opened up enough to quit functioning. But there we have that. That's about it for controls. It's a relatively simple blaster to operate. It's the inside that's a bit more complicated. So we're going to get this thing apart and take a look. We're going to start by taking out the battery tray. This blaster takes 6 D cells, which makes it heavy and somewhat expensive to operate. We can disassemble the battery tray further if we want to. I'm not going to, but I will explain how you can. There's 6 screws on the bottom that would come out, and then there are 2 screws on this side, which will allow you to take the end cap off. And if you wanted to have the battery tray empty so you could rewire it for LiPo or something, that would be what you would do. You'd just take this off and just use it as an end cap. However, these 2 screws are not Phillips head screws. They are in fact triangle screws. And so you will either need a triangle bit set, or you might be able to get it open with a flathead screwdriver that's small enough to get into the triangle on 2 points and get it off. But I don't know why they did that. It's a very bizarre place to have those. I guess they wanted you to not take those screws out trying to take the battery tray out, because they are on the battery tray. I guess they were concerned that people would often take those screws out when they're meant to just take the back 2 out. I don't know for sure, but there's our battery tray, and we're going to leave that out. And now we are going to disassemble this blaster. And the Stampede has no shortage of screws, and I will explain which ones are which size as we go along. All right, that should be all the screws. Let's see if it will open up. You may, as I have to here, because this is the first time I've opened this blaster, take a knife or a screwdriver or something, and inside the battery tray there is a disclaimer. And you are going to need to cut that sticker as it is holding the shell together. Now we can take the shell apart. And one thing to note when you take it apart, because there is the on-off switch on the left side of the shell is connected to the right side of the shell by a wire. And I've dropped a screw. It's a good idea to check the shell, make sure all the screws have come out. I think they have. And the way a lot of the wires in here are held down is there were a pair of prongs that came up that they then melted closed over the top of the wire. And we are going to have to break those loose. You can do it with a pair of pliers so you don't risk damaging the wire. This does mean your cable management is not going to be quite as nice when you go back through, but you can use some tape or something to hold those wires down so they don't get caught in the mechanisms. And the first thing we're going to take off is going to be that switch. Now, one of the nice things about the Stampede, and a lot of older blasters at least, the interior screws tend to be silver, whereas the exterior screws are black, so you can kind of tell whether something was interior or exterior. But we have a pair of smaller silver screws in here. And that will take our switch off. And now we can focus on the inside of this blaster. There isn't a whole lot going on this side, but there are some things that we need to be aware of. So we have our magazine release. And it just has another slightly longer silver screw. In general, it's a good idea to keep the screws with the parts they came from so you can tell where they go. So I'll be keeping that with that. We then have our switch retention tab. So the way the switch stays up or down, there's just a little plastic tab that it clicks over. Again, keep it with its screw. We then have our actual on-off switch. Has two small washer-headed screws that are holding it in place. Take it off. The longer one goes on the actual part that, or goes on the longer tab. Shorter one goes on the one that actually retains it. Keep those in there. We have a spring-loaded bit here. All right, what this spring-loaded part does is it interacts with your jam door. There's a tab on the jam door right here that when it comes back, it pulls back on this linkage. The tab on the far side of the jam door interacts with a part on the other side of the blaster that unlocks the dart gate. And then when this pulls back all the way, it opens the dart gate. So if a dart gets jammed in the dart gate, opening the jam door all the way will unlock the dart gate and open it so that the dart can then fall out, or you can get it out if necessary. So that is part of the whole jam clearing mechanism. And it is held in place with a pair of washer-headed screws, and it's got its own little captive spring. We then have the whole front muzzle, which can come off, but it isn't necessary. It's just held in with a series of large silver screws. You can remove all of them and then you can take the whole muzzle off, but that is a purely cosmetic thing. There aren't any moving parts in there. You do have to remove that if you want to remove the side rail, so we might as well go ahead. And what I will actually do when I work on a Stampede, or if I'm modifying a Stampede, is I will leave the silver screws out of the left side of the blaster so that this can come out, because that way you can leave this attached to this side of the blaster and you don't have to take out all the screws that are holding the two sides of the barrel together in order to get into the internals, because there are no working parts up here. So you can leave those two screwed together, and it means there are fewer screws you have to take out in order to take the blaster apart. So be aware of that. And finally, we can take the rail out. Which I might actually, yep, I'm gonna need a smaller screwdriver to get that one, just because of where it's positioned in the shell. And then you have your side rail with its little spring-loaded nubbin. If you say wanted to replace these with Picatinny rail, if there was somebody had a replacement, you could do that. So that is the left side completely stripped to the shell. Let's take a look at the right side, which is obviously the more complicated. We're first going to take our spring-loaded. Oh, they are glued in. Well, that's nice. I'm going to leave it in there then. And is this one? This one is too. So the rail retention tabs are in fact glued in place, which is nice because now I don't have to deal with them. We're going to start. There is quite a few of them on here, and usually they are prone to springing. So apparently they glued them in at some point. All right, we are going to start with the front, disassemble that, and we have again a series of the larger silver screws holding our barrel in place, or rather the whole front muzzle assembly. And they are all the same size. We are going to lift our barrel out, and I'm going to go ahead and get the breech out of the way. So there's 3 screws holding the breech in. And then we pull down on the dart gate lock. We can remove that. We are going to leave the dart gate in because it's pinned in. There's our breech. But there was something living in here at some point. There's the other side of the muzzle section out of the way. Now we have this, which is the lock for the dart gate. Take it out. It has a small washer-headed screw. Now we see the first of our electronics, which is one of the magazine locks. And yes, I say one. There are, in fact, 3 different locks for the magazine, which I don't know why they felt it needed triple redundancy. Surely one would have been enough, but apparently not. So there are 2 on either side, and then there's actually one on the magazine release so that you cannot pull the trigger while the magazine release has been pulled back, which is a good thing so you don't accidentally, cycle the weapon while the mag is partially out and break stuff. So we will need to take out the small screws holding these in place. This one is for the jam door lock. This is a lock that if the jam door is open, it will not fire. We then have a plate here that we're going to remove. It has 2 washer-headed screws. At this point, we can also now reach the rail screws, side rail screws. And now we start getting into the real meat of the blaster. We're going to take out the trigger, which is again held in by a single washer-headed screw. We have a lock. This is a lock that prevents you from pulling the trigger when the magazine release has been pulled. We have a linkage bar for a switch. 2 washer-headed screws, same size as we've been seeing for most of the internals. We have another lock switch. This acts as the lock that prevents you from cycling when the magazine switch is back. We then have our magazine lock. It's got a regular screw holding the spring in place on the shell, and then a washer-headed screw that attaches it to the actual blaster. 2 washer-headed screws holding the lock, and then one holding the release tab. And this will come out. We then have another magazine lock switch. We then have a plate holding this lever. And these are, I believe, the 2 smallest screws. There are some others that are the same size, it appears. There's a number of different size small screws. We have this lever, which is the actual linkage between the trigger and the trigger switch. This right here is our trigger switch. And all of this red wire that we're seeing, from the battery through the on-off switch up into this whole assembly of switches, is all one long circuit. And all of the switches have to be pressed or turned on for the circuit to be complete. A single break anywhere in there, any of these switches go bad and the blaster will not operate. And that's a lot of points of failure, but they're fairly robust switches. It can actually take a lot of voltage and a lot of abuse. We're now going to take out our motor, or we're going to try. We'll see how this actually works out. There is a retention plate, and it should lift out. And then pull. Got another melted section holding our wires in place. And another. And we're not actually going to be able to remove all of this completely because the contacts are very much glued in place. You would have to break a lot of things if you wanted to actually remove the contacts and bring that entire wiring loom out, but it's not necessary, so we are going to leave it in. We'll just tuck it in here in the battery tray so it's out of the way. But that is the entirety of the electronics. There is one big motor and 6 switches. Nope, 5. No, I was right the first time. 6 switches. Okay, can now remove the rest. We're going to take out the whole bolt and plunger assembly. So we have a pair of screws up here in the front. This is the guide for the bolt. It also keeps the return spring in place. We then have this cover plate here, which is what is holding the entire plunger assembly in place. We can now lift the entire bolt, plunger tube, plunger assembly out. We're now going to remove this part, which is an operating linkage. This is the part that interacts with the jam door to unlock the dart gate. Now take out our catch and another linkage. This is what actually releases the catch when the blaster fires. There is a captive spring in there, be aware of that should it wander. We've got a plate up here, which is a guide for the jam door and the part that some of the parts ride on as they move. Finally, we have our gearbox. We're going to pull that out so we can take a look at it. And then last but not least, well, it probably is the least, there is a clear section of the shell just because they wanted to be able to see the blaster cycling, because I think they thought it was a cool mechanism, which it was. And there are 4 screws that hold that in place, should you want to remove it for painting or doing something clever. Alright, minus the electronics, which if you did want to remove, there's simply a tab that's been glued in that you would need to break, and you kind of got to tear it up a bit in order to get the lower tab off, or you could unsolder them. I'm not going to. I'm going to leave it all in there because it's, like I said, not necessary to take it out, and that is this reduced to the shell, other than things that are attached, like the rail nub, and these bolts for the battery tray are actually very stoutly in there. And that is the Stampede fully disassembled. Now I'm going to reassemble it and explain how everything works. Alright, the heart and soul of the Stampede, and what you need to understand if you're going to understand how the Stampede operates, is the gearbox. So we're going to open it up, and here's what we have inside the gearbox. Unsurprisingly, a series of gears. There are 4 gears in here, and they are set up so you go from a larger gear to a smaller gear, to a larger gear, to a smaller gear, larger gear, smaller gear. And that is what gives you mechanical advantage. So moving this first gear, it takes a lot of moving the first gear to get the biggest gear to rotate, whereas it only takes a little movement on this one to make the little one spin a whole lot. That is what is called mechanical advantage. That allows us to take a relatively weak motor but drive something much more powerful, and that is how a single motor running on 9-10 volts is able to compress that spring. And the way it actually works is you'll notice that the largest gear here doesn't have teeth going all the way around. It only has a section of teeth, similar to an auto strife pusher. And it works very similarly. As this gear comes around, it picks up the teeth on the bottom of the plunger tube and forces the plunger tube forward. But in its resting position, the plunger rod is actually caught. The catch is engaged when the blaster is at rest. And so when that gear picks up the teeth on the bottom here, it forces the plunger tube forward, whereas the plunger rod stays in place, rather than you pulling back the plunger rod. In this one, the plunger tube and the bolt are forced forward, and when it gets all the way forward, there's an automatic linkage that releases it. At the same time that it's being released, or probably a fraction of a second later, the last of the teeth on this gear pass, and it will release the plunger tube, and this return spring will slam the whole assembly back and reset the blaster. This is very similar to what we saw in the Centurion, if you saw my reassembly guide on that. When you prime the blaster, the gears force the plunger tube forward, and then when you pull the trigger, it releases the catch, and the plunger tube goes forward, and then the whole thing slams back. In the Centurion, it's a reverse plunger system. This one is a direct plunger system, which does make it easier to upgrade, but there are limitations. The plunger tube is not particularly large on this blaster, unfortunately. It's nowhere near as large as, say, a long shot, which would have been really nice. And so there's a limit to how much power you can get out of it before you start running into problems. You can put a heavier spring in, but if you put a heavier spring in, then the motor has trouble getting enough torque to actually prime it. If you then put a strong enough battery in to get enough torque, the teeth on these gears start having issues and will break. And so there are replacement metal gears, and so on and so forth, and you have to keep upgrading this, and then now this gives out and you upgrade that, and this gives out and you upgrade that. And there were limitations. Luckily, there are now blasters that overcome that. There were kits that would allow you to improve it. Metal gears being a first one. So let's take a look at these gears so you can understand what order they go in. Now this gear, the one that connects the two smaller gears to our big gear, does in fact come in two pieces, and this is a common point of failure, that the clutch power on this will give out and this will simply rotate and the blaster won't fire. In the past, I have actually had to tap in and put metal pins in to hold that in place to keep it from rotating. Obviously, the better solution is just get the metal gear kit. So the first gear we're going to put in is going to be the big gear. They all have pins. There's the interrupted side goes down, the solid side goes up. Next, you're going to put in the gear where the spokes are on the same side as the small gear. That goes on the very first one. You then have to put the next two in at the same time because they overlap because of that notch. So you've got the one where the spokes are pointing away from the smaller gear. You have the gear with the gear below it. You put them together and slide them onto the remaining two posts. And then make sure that everything works. And again, always make sure to add lubricant anytime you're in here because you're going to get some of it on your hands. You're going to get little bits of grit in there. And so you definitely want to re-lubricate the system. I use the tube grease that came with the metal upgrade kit. Just put it in the gears, let it work through. It should spin smoothly. Okay. Now we start the full reassembly. So the first thing we're going to do is reassemble our gearbox. Make sure the pins line up. 4 of our shorter small screws, not the smallest, the medium-sized silver screws. Make sure you're putting them in the correct screw ports because we can also see all of the screw ports that hold it to the shell. There's one here on the end, and then the other 3 are fairly obvious because they're not on the outside edge. Now we can start reassembling the shell. The first part that I'm actually going to reassemble is going to be the side rail so that I don't forget about it and end up putting parts over it that block the screw holes. So the 2 sections of side rail are identical. The section with the spring should be forward towards the front. Put it on from the other side, and then put in your 2 screws. These are the longer silver screws, but the longer, smaller silver screws. There are a fair number of screw sizes in this blaster, which is why I highly recommend keeping the screws with their object, with whatever they're holding in place. Next, we're going to install our gearbox using 6 of the mid-sized screws. And the shape matches the shape that's in the shell. The empty socket should be further forward. That's where our motor is going to go, of course. Get it down in there under the wires back here. Make sure it's actually locked into place, and then use your 6 screws to secure it. Once that's in place, we're going to install the cover plate that went up there, this part. It uses 3 shorter screws, but not the smallest ones. Next, we're going to install the catch-release linkage, these parts. Now it does have a spring, be aware of that. The spring is going to go behind a tab that's in here. Make sure that it gets in there properly, that it's not bunched up or anything, and then it moves freely. Then we have a plate that goes down over the top of it. With the extra section, there's 2 screw sections and there's a little extra tab. It's going to go towards the back. Secure it with 2 of the smallest screws. This is a part where a little extra lubrication doesn't go awry. It needs to move freely. There we go. We're then going to install the Dart Gate unlocking linkature, this series of parts. And it's going to go right here above the magwell, above the gear assembly. There is a post below the jam door opening, and there is a post on the clear window. The screw that's holding the spring is going to go on the post below the jam door. And then the toggle, the small piece, is going to go on that post on the clear one. And the wider section of it, there's kind of a wide section and a smaller section, is going to go up. And the small section should be pointing straight down. If you have it too far forward, it will get caught on some internal parts. So you need to make sure that it's straight up and down. It then installs with that washer-headed screw. And you can check the motion on this. If you push on the tab, the linkage should go forward. This is another thing that interacts with the jam door. As the jam door comes back, it picks up that tab, and that thing gets pushed forward, and that unlocks the dart gate. We'll see that a little bit more when we actually get the dart gate installed. This also gets pushed when the bolt comes forward. There is a tab on the bolt that also engages that in order to unlock the dart gate once the blaster gets far enough, once it is actually chambered around. Next, we're going to install our catch, these parts. And you need to make sure it's pointing the correct direction. There is a sloped section on the inside that needs to be pointing towards the front of the blaster, so when the catch comes back, it'll force this up and then it will lock down on it. If you put it in backwards, it won't catch. Sure that's in there properly, and then we have a cover plate that goes over the top of it. 2 of the longer interior medium-sized screws. And now we can see how that automatic release works. As the plunger tube comes forward, it's going to pick up this tab and pull the trigger release forward, which is then going to release the catch, or the catch release. So there's a delay, whereas this starts coming forward, chambers the round, fully cycles, and then it catches this right at the end and releases as it completes its cycle, and it will fire. And speaking of the thing going forward, that's what we're going to install next. We're going to install our plunger tube assembly, all of these parts. And I realized I didn't actually show you how to take it apart. There's just 2 screws on the back. They're not very big screws, which is kind of surprising because this is the most load-bearing part of the entire blaster, as this is what is holding your mainspring in place. But those 2 screws come out, and now you can, in fact, access the mainspring. This is direct plunger, unlike the Centurion, which is reverse plunger. It is actually fairly easy to replace the mainspring, and there are a variety of options, though the higher you increase the spring, the more you have to increase other internal parts. And it kind of just cascades. Anyway, while you're in here, you should always lubricate your O-ring, make sure that it's got plenty of lube, is moving freely. And then we're going to go ahead and reassemble, and orientation does matter. The hook section needs to be pointing up away from the teeth. And then on the bottom plate, there's a section that's got a little tab on it. That needs to be pointing towards the teeth, down towards the teeth. And these screws are, as I said, very important and load-bearing, so be very careful when you reinstall them. You're going to want to do a little rotate counterclockwise until you feel the screw lock down into the threads. You do not want to cross-thread these. You do not want to over-tighten it, or the blaster will not function properly because it'll just tear the back end off of the plunger tube when it goes to fire. So we don't want that. Now, to install this, we need to install it with a couple of other pieces. These 2 pieces, which are going to clamp around the barrel, and orientation is, once again, important. One side does have a little bit of an extra lip around the ring. That should be facing your return spring. Ooh, so it kind of holds the return spring in place, guides it. That's going to go on there. There's kind of some pins that'll help it hold in place. You're then going to slot it into the catch and bring it down onto the posts that these sit on. Come on, there we go. And then we're going to use 2 of our longer medium interior screws to hold this front bit in place. We are now going to install the plate that holds that in place. This part. It goes right on here, and you might have to pull it forward just a little bit to get it to actually seat down properly. Remember, the screw that goes into the gearbox is the shorter screw. Don't use a longer screw, or you might end up putting a screw right into your gears, which would be bad. All right, we are now going to start bringing our electronics back in, all of our switches and our motor, this whole mess. So we're going to start with the motor. So the motor goes in. Technically, the orientation doesn't matter, but we want these wires pointing backwards or things aren't going to fit in quite right. So get that situated in there properly. And we're going to put a couple of our medium length screws in. This bit that the wires are wrapped around and then goes down into this little housing for it, though there's nothing to hold it in place. The motor that's direct, or the switch that's directly connected to it, is our trigger switch. So we can manage the cables a little bit and get that pushed down into place. And then we're going to add this part. This is the linkage between the trigger and that trigger switch. Train. And it's going to go in underneath this retention plate on this post in the center so that when it gets pushed, it pushes down on this trigger switch. There is then a retention plate, this part, that goes in on top of it, holds the switch and that linkage in place, uses a couple of the smallest screws again. And you may be wondering why this part goes all the way up under this shell where the bolt is moving, and that is because that is how this blaster has cycle control. So if you just barely pull the trigger and the switch pushes down and pulls, the motor starts spinning, but you let go. If you do that on something like the Vulcan and it hasn't fully completed its cycle, it will actually just wind back down and won't actually fire. This will actually always fire no matter how much you pull the trigger. If you just barely pull it, it will complete one full cycle. And that is because as the bolt comes forward, it pushes down on this part and holds that trigger switch down until the cycle is actually completed. So the switch is still being held, so the motor is still going all the way until it gets all the way back and completes the cycle. And then it lets go if you're no longer holding the trigger. If you're still holding the trigger, then it will just keep cycling. But if you've pulled the trigger and let go and the blaster has started cycling, that is what makes it continue to cycle until the blaster completes one full cycle. So it's a mechanical way of doing the cycle control, which is kind of neat. All right, now that we have the motor installed, we need to get all of the switches into the right place. And this is one of the more complicated parts of this because, well, there's a lot of wires and there's a lot of switches, but they will only reach the places they're supposed to go. So you can work it out. If you start at the very back where the wire comes out, you're going to run, first thing you're going to come up to is going to be this nodule that the wires are wrapped around, and it's got a little box that it goes in. And then when you continue on, you're going to get to the switch that goes to the far side of the blaster, and it's going to come back to a pair of switches that are going to go down in the trigger assembly, and I'm going to zoom in to make it a little easier to see what's going on in there. The first one that you're going to run into is not going to be the one that you're going to install first. This one is going to be on top of all of our trigger assembly parts, and so we're actually going to move on to the next one in the sequence, and it's going to go down into this cavity right kind of up and to the left of the trigger well. It should have a little nubbin on it that comes to a point, and I don't think it matters which way that goes on. Actually, I believe the side with a lip is going to go down. So then we're going to get this in here, and it's going to be held in place with a pair of our smaller, but not smallest, our medium-sized, shorter interior screws. Check and make sure it moves correctly. And now we're going to have to deal with one of the more irritating parts of this whole blaster, cable management. The cables are going to come up under the motor. It's going to go above both of these two posts. There's then going to be a slight notch in the shell frame. And they're going to go through that, underneath this next post, and across. There's a channel here they're going to go into, and then there is a notch right where that side rail screw went in. They're going to go in through there and then down through this little slot cavity here. You want to keep this section open. There's one wire that kind of wants to go up that way, but if you do, it will get in the way of other interior parts. So it needs to go down. And you want to make sure that it's not on top of any of these screw posts. And once you get it down in there, we can secure it with a plate. This plate goes right over the top of all those wires to hold them down, keep them in place. This plate is held in with a pair of washer-headed screws. Now on this end we have two switches. One of them has a plate, a wider plate that actually has screw holes in it. We'll recenter that. That's going to be the lower one, and the other one is going to go up a little bit further. So tuck the cables in. There's another little notch here that the cables can fit in, and then there are two posts here that will situate right there. This one is going to use the two smallest screws we have, or at least in my blaster it did. The tab or the notch should be pointing, that's on here. You want the slope pointing up so that when the magazine comes in it will push it back. And then this one's going to simply come up and go in to the spot here that fits it, and that is where the jam door is going to come forward and engage that one. Make sure all your wires are tucked in wherever you can tuck them in. You don't want them showing, you don't want them getting exposed, breaking, stuff like that. Because if any of these connections break, if any of these switches go bad, the blaster will not operate. Alright, so that's all of that in place. We're now going to move back to our trigger assembly group, and we're going to install the parts that go here, starting with the magazine release assembly, this collection of parts. We pull this up and out of the way, make sure our wires are all tucked in as best they can be. This plate is going to go onto these three posts here. Two of them will be flush with the plate, one will be sticking up a little bit, and it has a little nubbin, little extra nubbin. That is where that goes. We're going to hold it in place with a pair of washer-headed screws on the two that are flush with this plate. We're then going to attach our actual magazine release from the far side. It locks in. There's only one way for it to go. and then it is held in place with just a standard medium-sized long interior screw. And finally, we have the return spring on this. It's a small little tension spring. One side is bigger than the other. That's going to go on the orange side. That's going to connect to the plate and be held in place with yet another washer-headed screw. And finally, we will connect this spring to the shell using a standard interior screw. It's a little tricky to get it on there because it is under a lot of tension, but you can hook it through the loop and then pull it forward and get it lined up. And there you have it. Now we have our magazine release, or at least most of it. The next part we're going to attach is going to be this switch, which is going to go on the two posts here and here, so that the nubbin goes into the little spot for it. Again, this will be held in place by a pair of the shorter, but not the smallest, interior screws. And now is a good time to assess your cable management. You're going to want to get stuff tucked down and away as much as possible. Put stuff under other wires if necessary so that things will be held down. We want a wire going all the way to the back. We want these wires inside tucked down as much as possible so that they do not interfere with any other moving parts, because we do have more moving parts to install. So tuck the wires in, but gently. You don't want to break them, because if you break them, then the whole thing quits working. Up next, we're going to install this part, which is a linkage between the switch we just installed and the magazine release that we installed. So it's going to go right in front of there on these two posts. And now when we pull the magazine release, this switch goes as well. And it's going to be held in place by another set of washer-headed screws. All right, check and make sure wires aren't getting in the way of anything, which they don't appear to be, so we can move on. Next part we're going to install is this, the trigger. And it's going to go precisely where you think the trigger would go in the trigger well. It's got a slot for the spring. Again, cable management check, and washer-headed screw. No wires in the way, good. Final part is this part, which is our trigger lock, which prevents you from pulling the trigger when the magazine release is being pulled. And this is the one you really need to keep an eye on the wires and make sure they're not getting in the way, because this is something they like to get in the way of, and then it will prevent you from pulling the trigger when the time comes. There we go. Okay. So now you can see when I pull the trigger, that part moves and allows me to pull the trigger, but if the magazine release is pulled, then I cannot pull the trigger. And that is important because you do not want the blaster cycling while the magazine is half in battery, or it will break things. You'll probably end up shearing your gears and it would be bad. So be aware of that. Moving back to the front of the blaster, we are now going to install the muzzle, or just the rest of the front of the blaster, call it what you will. It's going to go on there, simply slots in, and it gets held in place with a bunch of our larger, shorter screws. 7 in total. Up next, we have another situation where we're installing two parts at the same time. We're going to be installing the breech with the dart door and giving pets to Swamp Cat, and the lock for said dart door. So the breech, this part, and the lock, this part. The lock goes in underneath, spring pointed down, lever pointing down, and then they both fall into place here. If you try to install one before the other, it is difficult to install the other. So those going in together is the easiest way to do it. And then the breech is held in place with 3 of our large interior screws. And then there's a retention plate, this part, to hold that lock in place, held in place with a washer-headed screw. And then we can install the barrel, the jam door, and a part that I don't think I mentioned during taking apart, there's a cosmetic part that goes in the sight section of the rail handle. And that is it for this side of the blaster. We're going to zoom back out and do the other side. All right, first thing we're going to install on this side is going to be the side rail, because otherwise there are things that get in the way. Again, the spring for the nubbin is going to go towards the front of the blaster. You can see on the other side where it engages, but it's easier to put it in upside down. 2 long, medium-sized interior screws. We can then put the front section on, and it is held in place with another 7 of our large interior screws. We then have a linkage that goes right here under the jam door, this part. And there is a spring on it that you need to make sure is caught on the correct lip part there, so that it does force the part forward. Pair of washer-headed screws, of course. Make sure it moves smoothly. Next, we're going to install the magazine release. Mag release comes in from underneath. This then goes on top of it. There's only one way that it will fit. Uses a medium interior screw. Next, we're going to install the on-off switch, and I'm actually going to zoom in for this because it's a little finicky. The switch itself consists of 2 parts, these 2 parts. And it might look like it doesn't matter how they go together, but it actually does. So the switch itself is simply going to go in under there, that's fine. But then the part that goes in on top of it, this part, that little notch in there is not in fact centered. It's either pointing a little up or a little down. We want it pointing up, so that when you put it on there, the switch will actually toggle. If you have it on the other way, it can't toggle, it can't move. So if it doesn't fit one way, flip it over so it's the other way, and now it'll actually move up and down. There are 2 washer-headed screws, and one is longer than the other. The longer one goes in the back part, not the part that holds the 2 plates together. Finally, we have the locking plate, retention plate, clicking plate, this part. And it goes in on the post just in front of them, held in with just one of these shorter interior screws. And now this will click and hold in position, which isn't entirely necessary because the switch itself can kind of do that, but this makes it more haptic and is nice. Speaking of said switch, we're now going to flip this over, bring the other side in so that we can install the switch. The lever on the switch, the little tab on the switch, of course, needs to go into the socket on our switch. If it's not, it will just get caught and won't toggle. And this will be held in by our final 2 small interior screws. There we go. Now we kind of have to do some cable management, because once again, the things that were usually holding the wires in place, we had to break them, and so they no longer hold the wires in place as well as they used to. You can kind of fix that using tape if you want to, or hot glue, or you can just let the cables be a little loose. But make sure all your cables are back in place. And now we can zoom back out. All right, now that we have everything reconnected, but before we actually button it up, I'm gonna go through the firing cycle one last time to explain how everything works and to kind of point out which things might be causing what sorts of problems if your blaster isn't working. So remember, when we pull the trigger, it activates this link which presses down on our trigger switch, which then makes the motor go, assuming all of our locks are working and have been properly pressed. So you have to have a magazine in here. This has to not be pressed. The jam door has to be closed to press that. Your on switch has to be on. If all of that is correct, when you pull the trigger, this motor will spin and it will cause this big gear to rotate, which has teeth on only part of it. Once the part that has teeth rotates into place, it picks up the teeth here on the bottom of our bolt and causes the bolt to go forward. As the bolt travels forward, it's going to interact with a number of linkatures, and it's going to cause the dart door lock to unlock. It's going to then push the dart door open, and then finally, this link in the back will get picked up and it will in fact release the plunger, and the plunger will fire forward, the blaster will fire, the motor will then have the gear clear, the part of the gear that has teeth will clear the teeth, and the whole thing will slam back and reset. That is what should happen. Now what can cause problems, if the dart door is not in fact unlocking, then the bolt will move forward and it will it might fire the dart, but it won't actually be able to go anywhere. It'll just end up getting jammed in the dart door. Or if the dart door isn't opening in a timely manner, something might be misaligned. If the blaster is cycling, but it doesn't actually feel like it's ever releasing the plunger, it's just kind of whining and moving forward, but you don't get that initial ka-chunk to fire, it may be that this link has become fouled or is broken or is misaligned, or you have the back end of your plunger tube on upside down and it's not catching this and pulling it forward to release the actual catch. If you're getting runaway, there's a couple of things that can cause that, and by runaway I mean you pull the trigger, you let go, but the blaster just cycles endlessly even though you're not pulling the trigger, and the only way to stop it is to turn the blaster off. Luckily this blaster has an off switch, so you can actually do that. Then this link might be the problem. If this has gotten fouled or stuck, that can cause it to just never release and the motor will just continue to spin. Alternatively, if you've upgraded the battery and this motor is spinning much faster, but you didn't upgrade your return spring, then it might actually be that the section of the gear with the teeth is getting all the way back around and re-engaging the bolt before the bolt has even gotten all the way back. And if the bolt does not go all the way back, it never releases this lever to disengage this switch to stop the motor. So it'll just pick it up again and go forward, and pick it up again and go forward, and pick it up again and go forward, and never actually stop. This switch does have motor braking. There is a negative wire going in so that when it's released, it halts the motor, which is important. If you have disengaged that, if you've replaced this or you've rewired and you didn't wire in motor braking, then there's a good chance that that motor is going to keep spinning just long enough to pick up the bolt just enough to re-engage the switch and cause runaway. So be aware of that. Your jam door also then does have a couple of things that it disengages. When it is all the way forward, it disengages the lock, but when it's all the way back, it disengages the jam door lock, or the dart door lock, and on the far side it actually has a link that will then open the jam door, or the dart door. So opening the jam door all the way until it clicks will in fact open the dart door. If there's a dart stuck in there, it can then fall free. So be aware of all of that. That should give you some idea of how it works and what might be causing it to not work. Now we're going to try to close this shell back up, and the biggest issue is going to be our cable management, because these wires are no longer nicely held in place because we broke the things that were holding them in place. We could put in tape, or you can put in hot glue to hold them in place. Either works. Or you can just be careful, and when you close it up, make sure you can kind of look inside and make sure nothing's getting pinched by the shell or by any other parts of the blaster. It should go together nicely. Make sure everything is in there, jam door's in there correctly, shell's closing up. There we go. And now we can start putting in screws. And I'm going to put them in order of size. So we're going to start with our 4 smaller screws. We have 2 that go up here in the front sight, and could also be the sling mount. And then we have 2 on the lower rail here. We then have the shorter large screws, and we have a couple of them that are in more interesting places. We have one back here in our rear sling mount, 3 up here in our top rail, and all the rest go into the front orange section. All the rest are our larger, longer screws. All right, it is now fully reassembled. Batteries are back in. Let us check the controls. Put a magazine in, turn it on. Does it cycle? It does. If we open the jam door, it does not. If we turn it off, it does not. We can actually maybe see. Yeah, we can actually see. Hopefully I can show you. When you bring the jam door all the way back, it actually opens the dart door. Hopefully you can see it in there. But yeah, seems to be working. So there you have the complete disassembly and reassembly of the Nerf Stampede. The survey for which blaster you would like to see me reassemble next time will be over on my community tab. Feel free to go vote. And as always, I hope this was helpful, and thank you guys for watching.